Well, welcome, gentlemen. This is a special podcast involving members of our scholar community. My name's Ken Samples, and I'm part of the scholar team, and I'm joined by Dr. Miguel Endara, also our biochemist, Dr. Fuz Rana. And I think this is a very special topic dealing with enhancement, science, and technology. And I'd like to cover a number of areas. I'm going to kind of outline this. First, we'll talk about enhancements. We'll then move to the issue of transhumanism. Then we'll look at ethics of enhancements. And then finally, we'll talk about biblical and theological issues relating to this question. Fuz, I wonder if I could start with you. It seems to me, what do we mean by enhancements? And I have two questions for you. It seems to me that there are kind of ordinary enhancements and extraordinary enhancements. And maybe I could also tag on that. Are some of these extraordinary enhancements, are they really going to be viable? Is this pie in the sky, or will it really work?
Yeah. Well, for the first time really in human history, we're at a point where we can seriously entertain the prospects of using technology to modify our biological makeup as human beings, and in doing so, extend our capabilities beyond our natural limits, making ourselves stronger, more intelligent, more psychologically well-adjusted, maybe even extend our life expectancy, not in incremental amounts, but in a radically large way, where life expectancy could be on the order of hundreds of years. And so this is
now I'd call that extraordinary, right? Rather than just a mechanical arm or something that would be kind of normal. This is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that many of these enhancements are really arising out of what you might call real legitimate biomedical applications. So, for example, we know that there's somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 genetic disorders that involve mutations to a single region of the human genome. And there's a technology called CRISPR gene editing technology that gives the user the ability with high precision to edit the human genome or the genome of other organisms, where you can literally splice out the defective region of the genome and replace it with a healthy version of the genome. So this is something that could revolutionize the treatment of genetic disorders, where many of these diseases are rare. There's no treatment or therapy whatsoever for them. And so this could radically alter the outcome and the quality of life for people that suffer from these genetic disorders. But that same technology could be used to modify our genetic makeup in such a way that we now begin to select traits in human embryos, creating so-called designer babies, right? Or we could maybe even go one step further and genetically engineer human beings to be stronger, more intelligent, more psychologically even-keeled. And so this is where the enhancements come in. And the line between what is an enhancement and what is a therapeutic use is really very blurry. So, for example, there was a scientist in China who created an enormous amount of controversy because he did gene editing on human embryos and then implanted them into the womb of a surrogate carrying the child to full term. And the genetic modification that he made was actually knocking out the gene that codes for what's called the CCR5 receptor protein, where the HIV virus binds and gains entry into the cell. So these children, there were actually several children that were born, at least that's the claim, would have been essentially resistant to the HIV virus. So is that a therapeutic application, or is that an enhancement? So, the line is really very blurry, but that's what we see, like even with brain-computer interfaces or anti-aging technology, medical uses that are meant to really, address very real medical issues, but at the same time they could be co-opted to again extend, life expectancy. And so, what is therapeutic? What is just merely an enhancement? What is ordinary? What is extraordinary? The lines are very blurry.
Okay.
You and I have worked on this issue of transhumanism. Miguel has worked on it for a while, and I think we all would agree that the lines are very blurry.
Miguel, let me go to you. You, in your paper, you wrote an article, and you make a distinction between therapy and enhancement. Can you make that distinction, and it might help us as we're thinking about this.
Right. I define, or I understand enhancement as using science and technology to intentionally augment. So we augment by direct intervention the natural powers of the body or the brain. Now, the therapeutic use is just to restore normal function. So maybe under this stipulated definition, Fuzz, maybe your example of what this Chinese scientist did was more of an enhancement. There was no restoration of function going on. And if you allow me, Ken, I'd
Sure.
like to make a comment regarding Fuzz's point, which I agree with. There's a lot of gray area, a lot of things we don't know, we don't understand. We don't know where exactly to draw the line. But nevertheless, I think we should be careful not to engage what is called the beard fallacy. You're writing a book on fallacies and logic, Ken. The beard fallacy, that's the idea is as follows. We know what a beard looks like, and we know what stubble looks like, no problem. But how about when the stubble begins to turn into beard? Do we know exactly what point the stubble turns into beard? I don't know. Maybe nobody knows, right? We don't know. So we have clear examples of therapeutic use of science and technology, and clear examples of enhancement use of science and technology. But we don't know when the stubble turns into beard. We don't know when enhancement. When therapy turns into enhancement. So so the main point here is an epistemological one regarding knowledge. We shouldn't be skeptical of being able to distinguish one from the other, enhancement from therapy, just because we don't know where the limits of each is.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Miguel, because as you're saying that, I'm reminded of a concern raised by Brent Waters, who's a Christian ethicist, and has written an exceptional book called Thy Mortal Flesh, which I highly commend to everyone. It's a little bit dated now, but he's a really clear thinker. But his concern is that we really are seeing potentially a change in the focus of medicine, where it's no longer going to be to provide comfort and relief to those people that are injured or sick, maybe even provide cures in some instances. But medicine is going to become more and more a discipline that is focused on providing enhancements for people, beyond the natural biological limits. And it's very easy to see how, because of that gray area, how how people can go down that slippery slope as medical practitioners, right? Is, again, this example of is imparting resistance to HIV, again, therapeutic or an enhancement, because we take vaccines, right, that impart to us resistance, an immunity against pathogens in the environment. So we're circumventing, the disease process in doing so. So is that an enhancement, right?
Well,
you see what I'm going with.
Let me press you, Fuzz. I mean, when they talk about, and I do want to talk about transhumanism, but some of the big claims that our lifespan is going to be extended significantly, maybe doubled, tripled, and then the computer-brain interface, those are very big predictions. Do you think that that's viable to that they could actually carry that out?
Yeah, well, let's look at anti-aging, and here, it's, to me, it's fascinating to see how certain biogerontologists are beginning to think. Where, again, this goes to this this challenge distinguishing between an enhancement and a therapy. We all understand that aging is a natural part of who we are as human beings. It's part of our very nature. We grow old, we age, and as we age, we become infirm, right? We lose capabilities. And it turns out that most of the cost of medical care is usually at the very end stage of life.
Right.
That and one of the highest correlations with type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and cancer is age. The older you are, the more that's the biggest risk factor. And you have people coming along now in the biomedical community who are saying, maybe we should think about aging not as an inevitability, but as a disease. And that if we can arrest the aging process or reverse the aging process, we are actually providing a therapy which would mitigate cancer, would mitigate the occurrence of cancer and cardiovascular disease and dementia, and the list goes on and on. And so they actually see, this anti-aging intervention as being a therapeutic intervention, not an enhancement, right? Where they would then argue that life expectancies could very well be, hundreds of years, as opposed to, 80, 90 years typically that human beings live. So this again is where that gray area exists, and where I'm somewhat sympathetic to the argument being made that aging is a disease.
Okay.
Though again, it goes against our thinking, because aging is inevitable in everyone.
Yeah.
But can you intervene and reverse it?
Now, Miguel, when you make this distinction between therapy and enhancement, could I say that for you, enhancement means a change in the human condition, a fundamental change in the human condition?
Yes, I think you understand it correctly, Ken. I think it refers to a limit. We have certain limits, physical or biological, mental limits. Enhancement, what it does is it helps us jump over this limit, go on the other side of it, and in that sense it extends our limit, or you could say it changes us. It changes maybe the concept. It might change the concept of what it means to be human. I like the title of your book, Ken and Fuzz, Humans 2.0. Right. I think what transhumanists is trying to do is trying to create another version of humanity.
So again, another distinction in my mind philosophically is this distinction between degree and kind.
Degree and kind.
Right? It seems that the extraordinary is a different kind as opposed to degree.
Okay.
Let me then shift to the question of transhumanism. It gives me an opportunity to put up our book and actually to read a definition that we give for transhumanism that I think is meaningful and important. It says, transhumanism constitutes a broadly defined intellectual and cultural movement that seeks to transform the human condition through science and technology. Its audacious, futuristic plan is for human beings to reach an exponentially greater step in evolutionary development called the post-human state. This transmutation will occur when humans overcome biological limitations and greatly extend their abilities through the development of robust human enhancement technologies. Now, Fuzz, you have particularly spent time talking with people in the transhumanist community. I think it's important for people to appreciate that I think this movement is largely secular. But there are Christian transhumanists. In fact, there's an organization. Tell us a little bit about your interaction with transhumanism, their goals.
Right.
What are they attempting to do?
Yeah, and I have had the privilege of interacting with a number of people that would fall under the moniker of transhumanism, would embrace that label. And they are, many people are secular that are in the transhumanist movement, but there's a number of people that would hold to differing religious perspectives as well.
Okay.
And in fact, I had a wonderful opportunity to take part in what was called a virtual enlightenment salon with the U.S., hosted by the U.S. Transhumanist Political Party. So I got to interact with some of the leading transhumanists that were part of that political movement.
Wow.
And let me tell you, it's not monolithic in thinking, is that there's a range of perspectives that you see under transhumanism where many would probably share similar concerns that we have, as Christians, where we don't want to see, and this is where I very much agree with you and Miguel, is that I think, therapeutic use of this technology is wonderful. Limited enhancements are, to me, not problematic, but there is a line that you can cross where we suddenly lose our identity as human beings. And as Christians, of course, this is very concerning, but for a number of transhumanists, they share that concern as well, that they're concerned about the loss of human identity. So as aggressive as they are in terms of wanting to utilize this technology for enhancement purposes and to accomplish the transhumanist vision, there is a debate internally as to what are the limits, how far can you go with this?
Right.
So there is a range of perspectives within transhumanism.
Now we have a chapter in our book where I talk a little bit about some of the leading lights of the transhumanist movement. There were a couple things that struck me as I researched for that chapter. One was how committed these people are to transhumanism, and that these are really accomplished scholars, thinkers. It's tempting, I think, for many lay people to think this is just kind of a crackpot, futuristic idea, but there are some very accomplished people who affirm this and believe this. Miguel, what has your experience been in thinking about transhumanism? What strikes you about this futuristic technological perspective?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is that in certain way, transhumanists are seeking the kind of things that we all seek. So I think the first step in trying to understand a movement or a philosophy is to try to see what merits they have, where we can agree with them. I like a quotation made by the former chair of the President's Council on Bioethics, Leon Kass.
Yeah.
He puts it this way: the human soul yearns for, longs for, aspires to some condition, some state, some goal toward which our earthly activities are directed, but which cannot be attained in earthly life. Now, where we disagree, we all want transcendence. We all long for this condition. And I think for the transhumanists, they see salvation, or a particular type of salvation, in transhumanism.
Right.
In science and technology. We Christians wouldn't see it that way. So what Leon Kass says here is, yes, we agree, we all long for something other than what we have. We all recognize the human condition is not all that it should be. But we disagree. We disagree in that we Christians recognize that our salvation is not going to come from science and technology.
Now, Fuzz, the first time I heard of transhumanism, I thought in terms of two things. This is an eschatology. Yeah. This has a futuristic view. I mean, if I'm a naturalist and I have evolved, there's no God out there, but could there be a future for me and humanity? I also thought in terms of hope. Just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean that you don't yearn for meaning and hope and purposefulness.
Yeah, I mean, that's well said. I think, both you and Miguel are hitting upon a really important point, which I think really distinguishes the desire for enhancement from really the transhumanist movement. Transhumanism is ultimately, I think, a religiously motivated movement where the ultimate goal is salvation, not only for individuals, but salvation for the human species. And I think, Miguel, this idea of seeking after transcendence is really very real in transhumanism. Where they see death as the enemy, and they see death as being unnatural, which is really odd for somebody who holds to a materialistic perspective.
Right.
That there's something in us that recognizes the fact that death is unnatural. That's a remarkable insight that comes, I think, from transhumanists. And the tragedy of individuals dying, the tragedy of the human species going extinct. And so how else are you going to have salvation if it isn't through trust in the person of Christ? From a Christian perspective, then what do? You have to trust in what science and technology can deliver. And so there are people that see enhancements as being, maybe connected to the progress of humanity, but there's others that see this as really a pathway towards immortality.
Now, Miguel, you're a philosopher. Philosophers are very attuned to the idea of a worldview, how that worldview kind of illuminates the human condition. If you could kind of summarize, what do you think are some of the big challenges that come from a transhumanist point of view?
Okay, what are the deep challenges? Well, the deep challenges, I think, are ethical or moral. There are a number of issues. I don't know if you want me to talk about them all, but there are a number of issues that I think we have to consider when we consider transhumanism.
Outline some of them for us.
Yes, thank you. Well, here are some what we might call consequential problems or potential problems in transhumanism. Health, and by the way, these issues have been written about by the President's Council on Bioethics, and I think you, Ken, and Fuzz have written about some of these also. So one of the problems is health, or potential problem. No biological agent used for the purposes of extending human life or extending brain function is likely to be entirely safe. So there are health issues there. Another problem is unfairness. Enhancements give persons, especially those participating in competition, unfair advantage. We can consider athletes who engage in blood doping, or students who take stimulants before taking the SAT exam. So unfairness, unfair advantage. Another one is equality. The third problem is equality of access or distributive justice. It might be the case that only the people who are wealthy enough could purchase these treatments, these enhancements, so that their children will even be better off than they would be otherwise. And this will create, this creates a problem when it comes to distributive justice. Are the goods of society being distributed in a fair or just way? And it'll certainly, this problem will certainly, this is a problem because it'll certainly increment disparities among the social classes, social and economic classes. But I think the deeper issue, there are also issues with liberty. I don't know if you maybe we should, want me to go into those?
Yeah, talk about liberty a little bit.
Yeah, when it comes to liberty, a number of issues, and again, these are consequentialist, and maybe we could call them in principle issues. So one of the principles is despotism within families. We could imagine wealthy parents being more concerned about their child going to Harvard and their child becoming scientists, and so they purchase all of these enhancements for their children, and yet these enhancements might be dangerous. So despotism in that maybe the child doesn't want to do this, or maybe it puts the child at risk. So the parents' goals are put over and above the well-being of the children. Another problem is one that C.S. Lewis writes about, and that is the possibility of tyrannical regimes. We could imagine a tyrannical regime getting a hold of these enhancements and using it for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the people. And there might be a means by which they employ coercion on the people. C.S. Lewis says something interesting. Any power won by human beings, won by man, he puts it. Any power won by man is a power over man. That is, yes, these might be great technological advances, but if a corrupt regime gets a hold of them, guess what? It's going to be used against us. So I think Lewis's point is well taken. There might be, here's another problem with liberty. Some societies might place great pressure on having a high IQ or looking a certain way. And what do you do if you can't afford it, right? If you can't afford good looks through these enhancements, that's a problem. But again, the deeper issue, the in-principle issue, I think is different. And it has to do with what it means to be a human being. And this has to do with liberty also. What does it mean to be a human being? Well, at least what it means to be a human being is to have certain natural abilities, certain natural capacities, certain functions. Whether these have been expressed or not, that doesn't matter. The idea is humanity has these functions. And so what might be some of these functions? Well, or these capacities, we could think of our, first and foremost, as Aristotle would put it, the rational capacities. But of course, we also have spiritual capacities. We also have biological, physical capacities. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, Plato, Augustine, they all talk about virtue. So from the pagan world, from the Christian world, what I think they have discovered is these people that I mentioned, is that in order to flourish as human beings, in order to be on the path towards a fulfilling life, we need to perfect our abilities, our capacities. And how do we do that? We do that by acquiring, by cultivating virtue, and eschewing vice. So there are many different virtues. There are moral, intellectual, and even spiritual virtues. Of course, Plato and Aristotle don't talk about the spiritual virtues, but Christian philosophers and theologians do. So these virtues are really perfections of our human capacities, of our human nature. They help us develop or realize our human capacities, and they have to do with our thoughts. So there are virtues concerning thoughts. We should think a certain way so as to develop these capacities. We ought to feel in such a way that we're in favor of doing this, developing our capacities, our humanity, and we ought to acquire habits of doing such things that help develop our humanity.
I want to come back. I want to come back to the virtue.
Yes, go ahead.
Fuzz. Miguel mentioned health, fairness, access. You've thought a lot about that. What are your thoughts about some of those issues?
Yeah, well, I would agree, with what the issues that Miguel has outlined as being really the salient ethical issues, and I would also add to that there's also pro-life issues, which are going to be not universally shared, but will be, of concern for people that do hold, a pro-life perspective. Because, for example, if we're going to eliminate genetic disorders from the human gene pool, if we're going to create designer babies, it involves manipulation at the embryonic stage, which means you're looking at, creating embryos through in vitro fertilization. You're manipulating those embryos, you're selecting those that have been successfully gene edited, discarding those that haven't been. And so, that to me raises a lot of pro-life issues. Or some of the technologies involved in lifespan extension, involving the use of stem cells, can require the use of stem cells derived from, again, human embryonic cells. Again, those are pro-life concerns that also are of significance, right, are also of issue. Something else that Miguel touched on that I think is something I didn't initially think much about until I read again Brent Waters, and he was talking about what he called the loss of natality. And what he means by that is that as human beings, because we know that our lifespan is limited, we really invest a significant part of our life in really the next generation. Not only in our kids, our individual children, but in everybody's children. That we see one of the highest callings we can have is to work towards improving the future and the opportunities for that generation that is coming behind us. Now think about this. If you live in a world where you're trying to live as long as you possibly can, right? Suddenly the next generation becomes competitors, right? You're no longer concerned about the next generation in terms of doing things to benefit them. You're seeing them as competitors, where you're trying to do everything you can to hang on to your life. You don't want that money being invested, in the next generation. And likewise, that next generation is viewing the current generation as being, again, in the way, and, you talk about, this kind of despotic, effects of the technology. You're stripping away autonomy and freedom from the children if, for example, as parents, we decide we're going to do gene editing,
Right.
and we are going to impart certain qualities to our children through gene editing. Those children are not really given that choice, right? You're forcing upon them a certain destiny that strips them of that autonomy and freedom. And so the intergenerational issues are rather significant that I think oftentimes get overlooked, for these other issues that are rightly of concern.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about biblical and theological issues, and we'll bring back the ethical, the virtue issues. I was struck. You have, Miguel, a chapter in this book, which I want our audience to see, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Fuzz, I think you have, and Hugh has an article in here as well. I wonder if we could talk about something you bring up in your article, Miguel. I found it engaging. You mentioned, somebody commented about the right to be unhappy, old, ugly, and impotent. One of my favorite educators and philosophers is Mortimer Adler. And Adler makes the comment that being young is good, but being old is good too. There's maturity. He even suggests that you can't be an educated person until you at least reach the age of 60, simply because you've lived life, you've had maturity, you've grown, you've developed virtue. Talk a little bit about that challenge that this kind of future technology faces in terms of just kind of the ordinary circumstance.
Of course. Psalms says the following, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So what does that mean? God has given us a certain amount of time to live here on earth. And whereas maybe as we're growing up, maybe in the early stages of life, we may develop a love for learning, self-control, temperance, patience, and other virtues. As we mature, maybe we should focus in on other virtues, wisdom, justice, benevolence. So there's a time and a place for everything. There's a natural development of our humanity. My concern is if transhumanists get their way, we have a version 2.0, this will change what it means to be a human being. This is what it means, change what it means to be, to flourish. And maybe we won't even be able to flourish, especially if flourishing is not due to the limits of our humanity, but because of the limits. It's not in spite of the limits, but because of the limits. If we have limits, our flourishing is connected with those limits, because those limits are part of what it means to be human.
Now you mentioned as well, suffering in life. St. Augustine said that suffering is a severe mercy. It's severe because it's painful and it hurts. It's a mercy because somehow it transforms our character and tethers us to God. Irenaeus, one of the great church fathers, talked about a soul-making theodicy. Fuzz, what about that issue? Is it possible that with all of these enhancements and the potential good thing of removing pain and suffering, that it might take away from the idea that, if you're a football player, you got to lift weights, you got to practice, you got to be disciplined. Is it possible that this could take away from the transformation of the soul and the character of the individual?
Yeah, well, I think the point that Miguel makes, that you've made, are very strong points. And I would add to that, and I wish I was the one that came up with this, but I wasn't. But it was a philosopher by the name of Ben Mitchell, who I had the privilege of being part of a panel talking about this very issue of transhumanism. And his point is that that having a limited lifetime here on earth that actually helps us to really appreciate life, that we live life to the fullest because we realize that our time is short. Mm-hmm. If we had a practical immortality, it would really strip us of any motivation to actually go out and pursue life with gusto, with a sense of urgency, because we have all the time in the world. And so, the propensity of human beings, if we know that we have all the time in the world, is maybe to never ever develop all of these and explore all of these wonderful things we could develop and explore as human beings, because we just are going to procrastinate. We have all the time in the world. And so while you and I and Miguel might think, boy, if I had another 20 years, I would really love to learn to play the electric guitar or something, but I don't have that time because my time is short. But the likelihood is that if I was able to live, again, for hundreds of years, I might never pick up the guitar, because what's the urgency of doing that? So there's an irony, right? In sidestepping, pain and suffering. This is where I think Christianity is really very powerful, is that there is a theology for pain and suffering, that pain and suffering have a purpose. And yes, indeed, we want to mitigate pain and suffering. We want to mitigate injustices in the world. And the reason why we want to do that is because when we do see people with severe limitations that are caused by disease, that are caused by injury, it prevents them from fully expressing their humanity, fully, living a life as a human being. So we want to help recover that and restore that and to mitigate that pain and suffering. But we also recognize that pain and suffering and the limitations that come from that can actually have profound meaning and purpose, which is something that I think is completely missing from transhumanism, and really from a materialistic view, where pain and suffering are just simply viewed as being unnecessary, as being, really the enemies of humanity.
Can I say something about
Jump
that?
in, sure.
Would you mind? Yeah, but even in psychology, there's something called adversarial growth. Psychologists have worked on this. That's the idea that human beings can use great suffering and traumatic events as springboards for growth and development. So psychologists are beginning to recognize, I think, what Christians have always recognized, that pain and suffering can be a springboard for us to gain the virtues. I think we may consider the people maybe who are wisest, the people who are most beneficent, the most kind people we know, the most gentle and loving people we know. Empathetic. And we could ask ourselves, are these people this way because they had an easy life, they were born into wealth and they had everything they wanted? Or did they experience many, traumatic events, hardships? And it is because of these hardships, when they encountered these hardships, they took what we might call the high road. And they don't have bitterness, they don't have envy, they don't have pride because of these traumatic events. So if we think about that, maybe the wisest and the most benevolent people are the people who have suffered much. And again, this is something that Christianity has long recognized.
Now, there's a couple topics I want to touch on before our time runs out.
Of course.
I want to talk about the Imago Dei, the image of God. We're made in the image of God. We have inherent dignity and moral worth because of that image. But I think it's the Westminster Shorter Catechism says that the chief end of man is to know and love and enjoy God forever. What I think, Fuzz, is missing one of the things that's missing in the transhumanism vision is there's no beatific vision where we come to encounter God. We encounter a holy, righteous, benevolent being, and we enjoy him forever. That was our ultimate goal. In our book, you talk about transhumanism being somewhat of a counterfeit philosophy. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're discussing at this point the issues concerning really what does it mean to be a human being and the loss of human identity, which is of really poignant concern for Christians because of this idea that we're made in God's image. And that image of God not only defines us, but it's critical for our relationship with God. But it's interesting to me that there are some transhumanists that recognize that concern, and it's expressed, a little bit differently, but it's something called the salvation paradox. That there actually are transhumanists that are concerned about taking enhancements to the point where we evolve human beings into humans 2.0, into post-human entities, because they realize that what is going to supplant us would not be us anymore. We're not saving ourselves, but we're saving that which we have created.
Yeah.
And so this is called the salvation paradox. So there's this concern about a loss of identity, for that reason. But, that really highlights, I think, one of the reasons why ultimately transhumanism must be viewed as a counterfeit source of salvation, if you will, because it can never truly deliver what people are seeking after. But interestingly enough, I was surprised as I've interacted with transhumanists at how many of them are actually concerned about this same issue. Interestingly enough, the loss of human identity, the loss of their identity. If we could ever achieve what Ray Kurzweil hopes to, where we would upload our mind or essence, whatever you want to call it, into a machine framework, we have to recognize that what we've created is a copy of ourselves. If we could do that, it's not us that has been saved; it's a copy of ourselves that has been saved, right? And so this is the I think the one of the significant shortcomings of transhumanism, and again, it relates to a concern that we have as Christians about the loss of human identity.
I think we have reached a good stage to kind of summarize what, Miguel, I want you to begin. I want you to just kind of summarize what your thoughts and concerns are about enhancements, about transhumanism, about this, and then I'm going to have you do that as well, Fuzz.
Yes, if you don't mind, Ken, I'd like to give my main idea, my main thought, my main argument against transhumanism, and it's a philosophical, theological argument, and it has to do with the idea of human freedom, going back to human freedom. Genuine human freedom, I understand it not as the ability to do anything we want at any time, but genuine human freedom is to develop, by means of virtues, our human capacities so that we might do things that help us flourish. That's what virtue is all about. So one of the things, or one example of this, is maybe being a good husband. Well, do I have the freedom to be a good husband? I have the freedom to do anything I want to, but does that mean I have the freedom to be a good husband? I would say no. In order to be a good husband, I think, you're correct, both of you gentlemen are married, I'm married, but I think that we have to develop the virtue of patience. We have to develop the virtue of putting other people, our spouse, maybe our children, before us, of long-suffering maybe. Who knows? We have to develop certain virtues so that we will acquire the genuine freedom of being a good husband. Otherwise, I don't have that freedom. So that's one way we could understand virtue, but go back to your point, to summarize, we are not only biological beings and intellectual beings, we are, most importantly, spiritual beings. So whereas the virtues, the bodily virtues, the intellectual virtues are important, the most important virtues are the theological virtues. The theological virtues...
Faith, hope, and love.
There you go. Faith, hope, and love. Those are the theological virtues. And these are what we should be seeking to develop so that we may reach the beatific vision. Now, if transhumanism comes to pass and our limits are shattered, human limits are shattered, now we have a version 2.0 of our humanity, we are no longer... the design that God employed is no longer there. We have destroyed that design. We're something else now. And if we destroyed that design, the virtues of faith and hope and charity, we can no longer attain these virtues, because it is because of the way God designed us, because of the limits he gave us, because of the way he created us, because we live on earth only a certain amount of time, that we're able to develop these theological virtues. And it is only through these theological virtues that we may attain ultimate happiness, a unity with God, again, reach the beatific vision. So that's the most important point that I see when it comes to consider when it comes to transhumanism.
Now, Fuzz, you share many of the criticisms that Miguel has articulated, but I've always gotten the sense that you think there is a place, there is common ground that Christians can have with people who affirm some form of transhumanism. Summarize your point of view.
Yeah, and first of all, I just want to say that, I think for Christians, one of the most pressing issues is the issue that we've just been discussing, is the loss of human identity and the loss of, the image of God, or because the image of God isn't just simply an immaterial quality that we have. We're not a ghost in the machine. There's an interplay between our spiritual or physical makeup. And so what we do to our physical body can very much alter and undermine God's design. And so the concern is, where is that line,
right,
that we know that there's a line, we don't want to cross that line, and so to me, the question becomes, it's really, that line is very nebulous, it's ill-defined, it's hard to come up with clear criteria. So I very much appreciate the approach Miguel has taken, looking at virtue ethics as a set of criteria that maybe helps us to determine where that line is. I think I like to think about the image of God, and if I make a modification to my biological makeup, am I somehow, detracting from the image of God? Am I detracting from my relationship with God? And so, to me, I think we do share a lot in common with those people that are proponents of human enhancements, that are transhumanists, in that we see the technology that's undergirding this as being very powerful and worthwhile exploring and pursuing, at minimum for therapeutic purposes. We live in a world where we employ technology. As human beings, we have this intimate relationship with technology.
Right.
Our capacity to create and use technology defines us. And so so we use technology to overcome our natural biological limits, but this is part of the dominion that God has given us, I believe. The question becomes, when is that technology now, undermining God's design? And that's something that I think is a real struggle. For example, if I choose to amputate both of my arms and replace them with robotic prosthetic limbs I can control with a brain-computer interface, and that enhances my strength, yes, indeed, I've transcended a biological limit. But if I use that for noble purposes, right, to maybe allow me to construct, some kind of edifice or something that otherwise couldn't be built without that technology, am I lost something about my humanity, or have I maybe augmented it? So there's this, to me, what I struggle with is there is this line, I don't know exactly where it is, and so I'm not opposed to human enhancements as such, though I recognize that not all enhancements are equal. Some of them are extreme, as you would say.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the projects that not only Christians, but I think even non-Christians who are concerned about things like the salvation paradox have to wrestle with is, where is that line? And so I think Miguel's contribution is really very important, because it's a fresh way of thinking about where that line lies. And so I very much applaud the work that Miguel has done, and found it really provocative, and has forced me to think about things maybe a little bit differently.
Well, this has been a special podcast, and Miguel, you've been our guest. You're a member of our scholar community. You've been a visiting scholar. I want to give you the last word. What would you say as your final statement?
We have before us the challenge of transhumanism. Is it a good? Is it a boon for humanity, or is it a bane for humanity? Is it going to help us flourish, or is it going to take away from our flourishment? That's the question on the table, and these are serious issues that we have to consider. And may the Lord grant us wisdom to find our way through this.
Well, it's been a really good discussion. Miguel Endara, pleasure to have you with us. Fazrana. I hope that this will be the beginning of many special podcasts where we can bring some of our visiting scholars and allow our listeners to meet them and talk about meaningful issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my privilege.